Now, right from the start, we've compared the standoff to poker, bluffs, double bluffs, a very intense and high-stakes game of geopolitics. Vladimir Putin is a seasoned player, but this time he may have overplayed his hand. In November and December, Putin was in control. He was acting. The West was reacting. But now the tables are turning. The West is flooding Ukraine with lethal weapons. They've also rejected Putin's demands. So the Russian president is stuck with two options now. Number one, attack. Go to war with Ukraine. Russia may win that war, but at what cost? Hundreds of dead soldiers and later on a full-blown insurgency. It is strategic and economic suicide. Option number two is retreat. Putin can swallow the humiliation and pull back his troops. He can save his economy and his military, but it would be political suicide. The myth of Vladimir Putin will be busted. He will lose face in Russia and abroad. It's a lose-lose situation for the Russian president. A suicide mission on one side, utter humiliation on the other. Where did things go wrong for him? After all, Putin had planned this standoff perfectly. Last year, we saw two Russian buildups, one in March and April, and the second, which is still ongoing. The first standoff was largely ignored by the West because it was obviously a stunt. All the troops were moved in broad daylight. There were no supply lines, no medical support. It was clearly a ruse. Everyone saw through it. So this time, Russia planned better. Some of the weapons and troops arrived in secret. Supply lines were established. Field hospitals were set up. The message was clear. This time, Putin meant business. So why are things unraveling now? Because of two reasons. Number one, he overplayed his hand. In the early months of the standoff, Putin had the advantage, but he squandered it. His demands from NATO were too unrealistic. Joe Biden was never going to accept them. And reason number two, the West was better prepared this time. Again, Putin's miscalculation. A long standoff gave NATO a lot of time to coordinate, to send weapons to Ukraine. So by the business end of January, the equation had changed. The hesitant allies, like Germany and Turkey, were convinced now. Berlin has agreed to cancel Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades. Turkey's Erdogan says Russia would be unwise to attack. In other words, NATO had enough time to put its house in order. Plus, they've flooded Ukraine with modern weapons. What could Russia have done differently? Perhaps their demands from NATO should have been more measured. You see, diplomacy is all about give and take, but Russia's demands were a non-starter, a veto against Ukraine's NATO membership, and a pullback from Eastern Europe. NATO was never going to accept those terms. Also, Putin failed to build multi-front pressure. What do I mean by multi-front? China and the Indo-Pacific. That could have been a game changer for Russia. If Beijing had made moves in Taiwan and Russia made moves on Ukraine, the US military would have been spread too thin. Joe Biden may have even considered accepting Russia's proposals. But the opposite happened. China's support was limited to words. The only distraction for America was Kim Jong-un's missile tests, 6 of them in 27 days. It was a record for North Korea, but not enough to distract the West. So for all the bravado, all the troops and fighter jets, Vladimir Putin is the one who is boxed in. He's stuck between a suicidal invasion and a humiliating retreat. In fact, he's worse off than last year. Putin has given his neighbors an excuse to join the NATO. He has pushed them towards the Western camp. I can give you two examples, Sweden and Finland. Neither of them are members of NATO. They were happy remaining neutral. But when Russia tried to stop NATO from recruiting them, they pushed back. Let me tell you what Finland's president said. Finland's room to maneuver and freedom of choice also include the possibility of military alignment and of applying for NATO membership should we ourselves so decide. This is Finland. As I said, Putin may have overplayed his hand. Right now, his best option is to cut his losses and reach a compromise, maybe delay Ukraine's NATO membership or agree to focus the talks on eastern Ukraine, basically a symbolic victory, something he can sell back home in Moscow. His other option is to keep the standoff alive, see where it goes. We've seen it during the Cold War. It has happened before. But does Russia have that kind of money now? Remember, NATO is made up of 30 countries. 30, that's 30 financial contributors. Russia is funding all of this alone. So sustaining this build-up indefinitely may not be an option. The fact is, Putin is a hostage to his own position. He could have stuck with last year's status quo. But like all poker players, he forgot the golden rule. Quit when you're ahead. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.